So starting with that first slide, motivation, I'm assuming that everybody who came to a session on blind proficiency testing has a basic understanding of the term. Blind proficiency testing refers to proficiency tests where examiners and possibly other people across the lab are unaware that a case is a test or unaware that they're being tested. So it refers to essentially a test case being submitted to the lab, and it's not until it's been analyzed that an examiner is informed it was a test. And this is compared to declared proficiency tests, which I hope everybody on this call is familiar with. They're required for accreditation and an important part of quality control at most labs right now. And those are provided by companies such as CTS, Forensic Exam Advantage. They're sent out as tests. They are provided to examiners as tests and returned as tests. So everybody knows their tests, and they provide a lot of value. They can be compared across labs, a lot of value, but there is also value to blind tests. And they have in fact been suggested by a number of scientific commissions. The National Academy of Sciences report in 2009 recommended adding blind proficiency testing, blind test to proficiency programs. The PCAST report in 2016 specifically wrote that, quote, test blind proficiency testing of forensic examiners should be vigorously pursued with the expectation that it should be in wide use, at least in large labs, within the next 5 years. I don't have it on the slide. It went on to say that basically they weren't recommending it everywhere immediately because there was work to do figuring out a lot of the logistics. It wasn't ready for that now, even though it was a good idea. And the National Commission on Forensic Science didn't specifically call for blind tests, but did note that all forensic service providers to the Department of Justice should seek proficiency testing programs that provide sufficiently rigorous samples that are representative of the challenges of forensic casework. So that is not specific to blind tests, but that is also a problem that would be answered by blind tests. Because in order for a blind test to work, it actually has to convince an examiner that it's a real case.
Hey, Robin. I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think some of us are still not seeing the slides changing. Like we see just the PowerPoint, not yet the slideshow.
Great. Thank you for interrupting me. I appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and restart it, which is about the level of my technological sophistication. Fingers crossed?
Yes, that works. Yeah, that works for me.
Okay, I'm just going to move it, not because, well, we can move on to the next slide anyway.
Great.
Did that move for you?
Yes.
Great. Okay, and I'm going to try and keep my eye on time here and get to the meeting soon. So blind tests, by their nature, more or less have to mimic casework. So that's the key thing. There is also research that shows that people behave differently when they're being tested. That being aware that you're being tested can lead people to pay more attention, to try different things than they may have otherwise. And studies in other fields have shown different results when people are given both declared tests or blind tests. And these are sort of two major ones over a wide time frame. In the one in drug testing labs, those were two different studies in the 70s that were reported together in one paper. Blind tests had more false negatives, so they missed drugs that were there more of the time in both cases. In one case, they actually had more false positives, found drugs that weren't there. In the other test, they had fewer false positives. So still overall more errors when they didn't know they were being tested. And that also showed up in a study of blood lead testing programs in 2 large state laboratories. I don't remember if the study was conducted in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's a 2001 paper. And they went on to sort of investigate the differences in findings and document that it looked like labs were making special efforts when they knew they had tests. And so in a number of fields right now, blind proficiency tests are required as part of an accreditation process, et cetera. One last thought on this before we move on to the obstacles is you can see, hopefully from this slide, a conceptual argument as well for that. Sort of the arguments about how well people do might be focused more on that left-hand column or to some degree between conforming and non-conforming work. So conforming work means a protocol was followed correctly. The correct practices were employed. Non-conforming work means, the wrong, that was not the case. an examiner did not handle the case the way they should have, the test the way they should have. So even when you have conforming work, the process was followed, you can have you can have errors, false positives or false negatives, if an underlying method has an error rate, which is a topic for another talk, but most do, or all science has error rates. Within non-conforming work, you actually you may get the correct response as well from any of these. Poorly done tests can accidentally yield the correct response. Any of these could. They're more often associated mentally in our minds with an incorrect result. And a key thing to notice here is really the last two are not going to be very visible except in a blind test, because malpractice and misconduct are intentional acts, the kinds of things we'd like to believe don't happen, but in not just in forensic labs, in any field, you can't ensure that there are never any bad actors. But malpractice or misconduct are things that examiners, that if they are occurring, somebody would be trying to hide, and they would likely not show up on a declared test. And the most recent Bureau of Justice statistics data on who's doing blind proficiency testing is actually from 2014. And the key things to notice on this slide is this compares 2002, 2009, and 2014. And while almost all labs are doing some form of testing, the vast majority of it's declared, and the rate of blind testing has actually gone down from 2002 to 2009. And actually the absolute number of labs doing blind testing has gone down. I looked up the 2002 census, and there were 351 labs included in that, and there were 409 labs included in the 2014 census. So it's not just that new labs were coming online, it's both the rate and the number were. And there's a much higher prevalence of blind testing in large federal labs. It's much less common in state, county, and municipal. So with all this in mind, we hosted a meeting in Pittsburgh in 2018. I'm at Carnegie Mellon, based in Pittsburgh. We have a partnership with the Allegheny County Office of the Medical Examiner, which houses our county crime lab here. It's an interesting system. The forensic lab reports up to the medical examiner, who reports to the county chief executive's office. So we are not part of it. It's not part of a law enforcement system here. And they opened up the lab to host a meeting, and we had 7 forensic laboratory systems labs from fewer than 50 employees to more than 200 employees, mostly from the eastern half of the US, including the Southeast, and then also the Houston Forensic Science Center. We had representatives specifically representing the Association of Forensic Quality Assurance Managers rather than their own lab. And we had academics from University of Virginia and Carnegie Mellon, from a range of relevant fields. And we had 2 days of sort of presentations and very intense discussions about a number of the issues and obstacles to implementing blind testing. I'm behind on time because of my slow start, so I'm going to try and speed this up. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. So the paper on this page in FSI Synergy lays these out in some detail with discussion of possible ways, possible solutions to the problems. As well, if you go to the website and look for what are called insights, our communication staff did a great job of boiling that down into a one-pager that has some of the key ideas as well. So you can see these laid out in more detail, and I'm happy to send you any of this material. Just email me afterwards. But there were a series of essentially logistical issues that were identified. We'll come down to management decision-making issues as well. But the other fields that I talked about earlier on, like blood lead testing, drug testing, are generally dealing with a specific kind of evidence. Forensic labs deal with a range of types of evidence, many of which are complex and challenging to simulate. I see that there's stuff in the chat. I'm going to ask that if there's a real issue, if people could unmute themselves and let me know, just because I am not very good at talking and monitoring the chat at the same time. I'd really appreciate that. But many of these are very challenging to create tests for. And right now, the labs that we're aware of in the United States that are doing blind proficiency testing, I don't know the situation internationally, but the labs I'm aware of in the US that are doing blind proficiency testing are developing the tests in-house, because there really are not components that can be bought off the shelf that form a blind test. So once again, there is toxicology is much more like I just described at other labs, that you can order samples from RTI and repackage them possibly if needed. But, latent prints, trace evidence, firearms, seized drugs, these can be challenging just to create a realistic test, figure out where to source, how do you source seized drugs, what is your ground truth if you're using, drugs that have been analyzed in past cases, et cetera. These are challenging cases to create. QA staff, ideally, this would work with examiners who test these things to create the cases. That raises challenges to keeping the cases blind. Labs that have done this, in particular Houston Tech meeting, develop expertise over time, essentially as test cases are discovered by their examiners. One example that was given is somebody said, hey, they were supposed to lift prints off a crowbar, and they said, nobody holds a crowbar like this in real life. Must have been you guys. Similarly, submissions material has to actually look realistic. Examiners work lots of it's hundreds of cases, are working many cases. So if fonts change, if an officer who generally does large drug busts is suddenly submitting something that makes no sense, these are things people are going to notice. People know their work; they know them well. Handwriting should look like it was, done by an officer at a crime scene, not slowly by a quality analyst in the lab. And they had cases that were discovered that way as well. And then again, cost. So toxicology is a great example in that logistically you can just order the samples, but you do have to pay for them, and they're not particularly cheap. I've talked to RTI about doing this. And most labs right now that are doing blind testing are doing it in addition to a declared program. So you have to be able to do that. In some cases, it's primarily staff time. Actually, many of these other types of evidences, the key thing will be staff time. Some cases there are external costs as well. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but this is another key issue that varies lab to lab. In order to test the whole pipeline, your blind case must be submitted by a law enforcement agent, right? By a law enforcement agency. And there isn't a way around that. If you are just testing an analyst on their component of the case and in a laboratory with context management such that they don't see the submission materials, this may not be true, but generally tests are going to have to be submitted from the outside. If you support one jurisdiction, that means you have to work with that. You need that jurisdiction has to be on board to partner with you. In the case of Allegheny County, which I included here, our lab here supports over 100 jurisdictions. So in that case, you actually have to decide who to partner with. It has to be a relationship at a high enough level such that there will be support for the blind testing program to do this in a jurisdiction also that has enough cases of the types you want to test that adding a couple for your quality assurance program won't be obvious. You might have a great relationship with a small jurisdiction, but if they suddenly start submitting things they've never submitted before, that will again be a giveaway. And the last two are somewhat related, which is you also want to ensure that while these are submitted from the outside, these results don't go out as if they were real test results. Not a good plan. Not a good plan. And if you are doing blind proficiency testing, for example, with DNA or latent prints, this means your CODIS team and APHIS, or I guess NGI now team, will need to be involved. You again will want somebody probably in the submitting law enforcement agency who's aware of what's going on. So if something is accidentally sent back, it can get flagged, possibly a contact in the DA's office. And in talking to primarily quality managers who really run these programs, it's a constant balancing act. Who needs to know to make sure everything works versus keeping the pool small enough that blinds remain blinds, that blinds don't actually, the information doesn't actually get out. Okay. And the last two are mostly on a slide to save space. They're not particularly related to each other. But you will also need to think about whether you're going to include these in your metrics, right? Proficiency tests are being submitted as cases, so should they be considered when calculating metrics on turnaround time, average processing time, et cetera, or not? These are currently lab to lab decisions. These could be areas where some of the professional organizations or bodies could play a role in setting some standards there. And the last one I include here was there was actually really significant and lengthy discussion of this last bullet point, that blind testing, as we frame it here, we say blind testing challenges the cultural myth of 100% accuracy. But the gist is forensics is high stake work. Forensic analyses are high stakes work. They're important high stakes work. And there has been shown in research in other areas, a history of treating it as treating 100% accuracy as the only acceptable outcome and as an achievable outcome. Those of us who are coming to it from other fields of science generally don't see 100% accuracy as an achievable. I mean, every procedure and every scientific procedure has an error rate anywhere. It might be very small, but there's an error rate, and every human to some degree is capable of errors and mistakes as well. So from where I sit, it's easy to argue that that's okay. That's the nature of science, right? That's the nature of science. And what we do is try to assess, characterize, and improve error rates. And that has to actually be, that for blind proficiency testing to work, that actually needs to be the culture at a laboratory. And there was universal agreement across the people present at this meeting, which were representing laboratories interested enough in blind proficiency testing to come to a meeting about it, that having a senior champion was, senior management champion was crucial to the success of a blind proficiency testing. And in fact, having engagement with and buy-in across the community of stakeholders was really important to the success of a program, because these results are used again in high stakes cases and important work. I have one, this is not chosen for anything particular about the case, but again, forensic experts are testifying in high stakes work, and everybody has to understand the importance of the work, the limits of the work, and the value of tests that are of proficiency testing as part of a continuous quality improvement program, as a way to identify areas where a system can be stressed and improvements can be made. And in fact, another researcher in CSAFE, Brandon Garrett, who's going to be talking in this room after me about a different study, had another paper out during this year where they did an online survey of potential jurors. They were matched to the demographics of the US. They were all US citizens, so all people conceivably eligible to be on a jury pool and of the appropriate demographic breakdown. And they were given a very short mock burglary case and then a very short transcript of expert testimony, like 800 or 1,000 words. And there were two scenarios. One, there was a bite mark analysis, and one had a latent print analysis. And within each of those fields, the only thing they varied was the proficiency of the examiner. They either in the testimony had the examiner did not discuss their proficiency, or they said, my laboratory has, this went fast. Says my laboratory has a blind, I'm being told it's closing soon, has a blind program, and I made mistakes on 6 of 20 cases, or that people were high proficiency. And, on that very low proficiency scenario, it did have an impact on jurors' potential assessments, as you can see here. Okay, this is important. These are the stakeholders who need to be involved. I have not seen the participants in this breakout room, but I saw that CTS is here at these talks today. So that's really exciting, especially the two on the two on the left I've talked about the most, but all of these organizations on the right can really play an important role. And I'm not going to be able to spend too much time on this paper, but I do also recommend looking at this. This is written by the quality assurance team at Houston Forensic Science Center. One of the people on the call is Madison Newman, who is jointly employed by CSAFE, which is why I get to include it in my talk. But they really go through in concrete detail what it's taken to do this there. And that's at a laboratory, at a very large, well-staffed, well-resourced laboratory, what it's taken to do that and what they've been able to do. This is the blind QCs. They call them blind quality controls that they're putting through monthly as of the end of 2008. between 1 and 30 in a discipline. They aim to submit at the rate of about 5% of their caseload in a discipline. And this is the cost breakdown in US dollars. So that first line is really striking, right? If you actually do the totals, it's roughly comparable. The blind and declared programs are roughly comparable. I believe the declared programs are slightly higher, but it's an investment. It's an investment. Now, it won't cost this much. I mean, Houston does a lot of blinds because Houston does a lot of cases, but it's an investment. This is why it requires, you know, significant buy-in of the importance. And this is why another area we're really hoping to move forward on, I'm going to come back to this, is getting back to work we were making progress on before the pandemic really led most of the labs we work with to reduce staffing, et cetera, this year. Things like joint purchasing and a consortium and work from the agencies and from OSAC really could be helpful here. So this is our next steps. This is very quickly a quick look. They've published papers on their latent print and blood alcohol programs. This key point latent print is, I recommend looking at the last bullet point before Anthony pulls us out of this room. Of the prints that were entered into APHIS, which was 92% of the test prints, 47% of the searches generated a candidate list with the source present. This isn't my study, and this is usually where the questions are. But that's a striking finding that wouldn't come up in a proficiency test just of examiners who are sent prints to compare where the source is known to be there or not. So when they look at the results from a testing the pipeline perspective, there are a very large number of false negatives, right? There are fortunately no false positives, which is actually very encouraging. Examiners are not incorrectly associating prints that they shouldn't be. But this would be a very different table if you were to look at just the cases where the examiners, where the correct print was returned by APHIS, right? In this case, the correct print is in APHIS, the local APHIS. They keep it at the local level. And I think it's NGI now, and I need to update my speaking. But the print was uploaded, but the association wasn't found, not as the result of the examiner, but as a result of an issue that's actually they're currently investigating. So I think that's a really interesting point to make. Okay, so now I'm coming back to this. I think we're leaving here in just a minute. Our contact info is on the last slide. Do contact any of us through these papers, through CSAFE, through anyone at CSAFE will get you to me. We'd love to talk more. Sharon and Brett and Madison are going to be publishing a paper on a survey of latent print examiners on attitudes about blind proficiency testing as well as practices in their labs. I'm going to be launching a survey of laboratory managers later this summer. We are working on, like I said, coming back to the original work of coming up with a more up-to-date listing of labs that are currently doing or planning to do proficiency testing and helping to facilitate, and we're also open to helping to analyze those tests moving forward as the labs we're working with seem to be coming back up to capacity as we're moving into, you know, a new normal. And I would also, we are currently engaging with one proficiency test provider from Australia, oddly enough, about test materials that could be used in the creation of blind tests, and we would love to talk to more.